Hey everyone, this is Darcinovia here. In this review, I'm going to talk about the Clone Wars movie novelization. Now, I make it no secret I'm not a fan of the Clone Wars TV series. For a time, actually, I have a confession. I actually hated it more than I hated the sequel trilogy. Because, well, I'll get into that at a later date. But that's just one confession I have. The movie itself, I gotta bring this up before I talk about the novelization because I feel like it's relevant. I didn't like the movie. I think the movie was so bad that it turned me off from watching the show. And I didn't watch the show until almost 10 years after it aired. That's just how much I hated the movie because it was so bad. Now, considering that I'm going to the Clone Wars timeline and it was inevitable I'd have to go through TCW-related material, starting with the movie novelization. Does it improve upon the movie like the prequel novelizations do? The answer is no, it doesn't. To be honest, what I get the vibe from this novelization is a disconnect between Dave Filoni and Karen Traviss. It felt like there was no communication between these two. There's such a disconnect that this novel feels disjointed at times. Even if you view it as its own independent book within itself, let's pretend that the movie doesn't exist for a moment, it still feels disjointed. It doesn't really feel like it really fits very well with the rest of the Star Wars universe. If there was more communication between Dave Filoni and Karen Traviss, we could have had a more accurate representation of the movie. Don't get me wrong, the movie was horrible. But Ahsoka and Rex aren't like they are in the show. At least in what we see from the movie. They feel like completely different characters. I know at this point they really weren't established, but it would not have hurt Dave Filoni to fucking communicate with Karen Traviss and basically told her, hey, Karen Traviss, this is how Ahsoka acts. This is who she is. This is who Rex is. This way, we have more consistency. So this feels like it's more coherent with, the movie. Another thing that I find that really irritates the shit out of me, that there was no communication of where this is supposed to take place in the timeline. I know this is a highly debated topic because I know there's people in the EU camp that hate the Clone Wars TV series and reject everything related to it, and then there's those who like the Clone Wars TV series and like to incorporate aspects of both multimedia projects. They should have, before this was written and before the movie came out, I'm just bringing up the novel because in the movie, they should have decided right then and there when the movie took place, so we would not have the continuity mess that the Clone Wars timeline ultimately became after this book came out. There isn't too much contradictions with previously established lore with the EU. It's consistent, but if you're going to try to fit TCW and the novelization, you cannot fit both the movie and this because this doesn't fit very well. Because it's established now that the movie and the novelization takes place 2 weeks into the Clone Wars, while this establishes it takes place during the second year of the Clone Wars. Now, it could be sometime like, during the beginning of the second year. Of course, in this book, Anakin is established as 20 years old. So, I don't know. This book is kind of a mess in terms of continuity. If you include the TV series. If you take out the TV series from the timeline, this novel, I think, fits relatively well. You'd have to move these books. This has to take place after Jedi Trial. No matter what, there's no avoiding it. But I'm not getting into that, my personal Clone Wars timeline in this video. But in general, this establishes Anakin as being 20 years old. So no matter where you place this in the timeline, Anakin has to be 20 by the time that you read this in chronological order. Of course, you could just ignore it completely, but you know who I am. I'm trying to do the impossible. Anyway, the Clone Wars movie novelization. The positives I like to list is I felt like Karen Traviss did a great job connecting pre-TCW sources, like she mentioned the Battle of Jabim. She had Asajj Ventress be a rat attack, like she is supposed to be in the EU. She was consistent with how Anakin is portrayed, and made Ahsoka not annoying, surprisingly. And of course, it helps that we get to read what goes on in these characters' head, and Anakin still has a lot of anger in him. And I do find him and Ahsoka bonding together in the novelization far more believable than in the movie. But again, I think if this didn't have the restrictions, I consider this pre-new canon restrictions that was placed on this. If she had more freedom to expand upon the events of the film, I think we could have had a much better novel. This novel feels like it was not finished. It feels incomplete to me. There's so much material that could have been added to actually make this much better. I think it could have done better to actually flesh out Ahsoka, Rex. Of course, we know that Ahsoka does get fleshed out in the show after this, but I think we could have had more of a taste of what she was like, because we don't know much about Ahsoka at the point that she's introduced in this novel. Now, what do I think of it? I think it's terrible. It's disjointed. It's held back by being constrained to the movie. I think if there was more communication with Dave Filoni and Karen Traviss, we could have made a novel that flows much better with the rest of the Star Wars universe. It doesn't contradict anything in the pre-TCW lore for the most part, with the exception of Anakin being 20. So if you place this after Jedi Trial, you're going to have some problems, considering you're going to have to move both books during the... I don't know, I'll get into that later. For the most part, I think it does good lore-wise, though. I think it would have been much better, like I said earlier in this review, if this book wasn't held back with being completely faithful to the movie. I think if Karen Traviss had the freedom to do what R.A. Salvatore and Troy Brooks did with the Episode 1 and 2 novelization, which took key scenes that were not in the movie and added them in there, I think we could have had something that was decent. Though it's hard to make something good out of the Clone Wars movie. To be honest, it's not worth your time. Honestly, there's better Clone Wars era stories you can read. And not to mention, this novel is pretty forgettable. Out of all the Karen Traviss novels I've read so far, this one's the worst. I mean, it's a novelization based off a shitty movie, and there's very little positives I can give it. The rating I give this is fan fiction trash. I don't think this is a good novel. I think it's worthless, considering the fact that even though it has some things that are good about it, like it being consistent with pre-TCW lore, the placement of this in the timeline makes no sense, and the lack of communication between Karen Traviss and Dave Filoni just makes things even worse. Do yourself a favor, even if you are a Clone Wars fan, avoid this book. There's far better stuff you can read in the Clone Wars era in Legends than this. Don't waste your time on this garbage. Next time, I'm going to review the first book of the Mid-Star duology, Battle Surgeons. Later, everyone, and may the Force be with you.